Alright guys, so today we're going to go over weapon damage in Once Human. The goal of this guide is to explain to you how to get your base weapon damage, how to increase that base weapon damage, and how that affects your crit damage and weak spot damage against enemies. One thing we're not going to really spend a lot of time talking about is going to be status damage. Things like shrapnel, unstable bomber, fire, and frost. Those are actually very complicated topics, and they would require their own video. So if it's something you guys are interested in after this video, let me know down in the comments and we'll look at doing some damage testing and putting out a second video explaining how those work and how you should optimize your builds around that. So having said that, let's hop into the video. Alright guys, while we're diving into how damage is calculated in Once Human, we need to keep one thing in mind. For all of our tests, we will be using the training dummy, which does have around a 5% base armor, based on all the tests I've done up to this point. So one thing you need to know is that your damage primarily depends on your weapon's base damage stat. For this test, I'm going to be using a max calibration tier 3 blueprint soaker. To keep things simple, we're just going to start with copper ammo as it doesn't add any bonuses to damage. Now before we jump into the testing, let's just go ahead and inspect the weapon. You'll notice that this one has 3 key damage bonuses. One for attack, one for crit damage, and one for weak spot damage. We will need to account for all of these in our calculations moving forward. So right now our weapon shows a base damage of 407. So let's take a shot at the dummy and see what happens. Now as you can see, the damage dealt is actually higher than 407. Well, why is that? Remember that we have an intrinsic bonus on our weapon. So let's go ahead and break that down. If we apply the 25% damage bonus, we would come up to 508 damage. But we're really only seeing 483 damage on the dummy. That's because we actually need to factor in the dummy's armor. So if we go ahead and reduce our base damage by 5%, that puts us at 387. When we apply the 25% damage bonus that we get from the gun, we get exactly 483, which is what we're seeing on the dummy. Now that we understand how to calculate the base damage, let's move over to crit damage. If we take our base damage of 483 and multiply it by 27%, we come up with roughly 130. So that is the amount of additional damage we're going to get from landing a crit. If we add that back to 483, we come up to roughly 613. Now on the dummy, we're actually hitting for 614, and this is basically just a rounding issue. So far so good. Next up, we have our weak spot damage. Our weapon has a huge bonus of plus 60% weak spot damage. If we take 60% of our base damage of 483, we get roughly 290. If we add that 290 back to our 483, we come up with a damage number that should be around 773. When we test this, we hit 774 in the dummy. Again, this is just due to rounding. Alright, so finally let's test how much damage we should deal with a weak spot crit. We already know that our crit damage should be roughly 130, and our weak spot damage should be 290. If we add those two numbers together, our total comes up to roughly 420. And when we add that to our base damage of 483, we should be hitting around 903 on the dummy. When we do shoot and hit the dummy, we hit 904. This is okay because this is just a rounding issue and everything else checks out so far. Now we're going to go ahead and switch the ammo out real quick to tungsten ammo, which adds another 10% damage to our weapon. Now this bonus applies similarly to our previous 25% damage increase. As you can see when we test this, the damage closely aligns with our calculations, with only minor differences due to rounding. Alright guys, so what I've actually done here is simulated some increases and shown how that will scale your damage based on those simulated increases. The goal here was to kind of give you an idea of where you should prioritize your increases when it comes to weapon damage only. So we're going to look at a couple of these charts. You can read over them and I'm going to go over this pretty quick, but the whole goal here is to show where you should theoretically be putting your increases if you only have a little bit to put. So for the chart to the left, we're going to be looking at a 10% increase to either base weapon damage, weak spot damage, or critical damage, and showing how that is going to affect your damage numbers. As you can see, when we add 10% just to the base weapon damage, we end up getting a pretty substantial increase all the way across the board from base damage, crit damage, weak spot damage, and weak spot crit. So as you can see here, if we add only a 10% increase to our crit damage, our crit jumps up to 715 from 663. Now that is an increase over just adding 10% to the weapon damage, but as you can see, we're not really gaining that much else across the board. The usefulness of this would be if you weren't really focusing on a weak spot build. However, you can see you're losing 40% base damage, and that might really factor into your overall DPS. So while you might be getting an extra 3 crit damage from this, you're going to be losing out on overall DPS. Now, if we add 10% to weak spot, our weak spot damage goes up to 887, but that is actually less weak spot damage than we would do with just a 10% increase to our weapon damage. So in this instance, you're actually losing damage across the board by putting that 10% into weak spot damage instead of putting it into weapon damage. All right, guys, now that we've looked at the 10% increase, let's really ratchet this up and look at a 100% increase and see how this affects things. All right, so if we look at the chart on the right, we can see that if we add a 100% to the weapon damage, we actually get a pretty substantial bump all the way across the board. Now, if we only add 100% to our crit, we can see that the crit damage is actually better than if we would have added it to the base weapon damage, and it goes up by roughly 21. The problem is you're losing a lot of damage on your non-crit hits. In this instance, you're losing over 300 damage. And if we look at it versus the weak spot, we actually get more weak spot damage just adding to our base weapon damage. All right, guys. So when it comes to these spreadsheets, I have checked them on my side by adding various different pluses and minuses, and the spreadsheets seem to function pretty much spot on. There's typically maybe a little bit of error for rounding, maybe 1 or 2, but for the most part, they seem to be fairly accurate. So I'm going to trust these numbers. The big takeaway here is that if you are able to add a specific amount, say 2, 3, 5, or 10%, or even 100% to any one of these 3 spots, you should always add it to your base weapon damage. And the reason behind that is your base weapon damage is always going to give you the most bang for your buck. Having said that, if base weapon isn't an option, then just add it where you need it. If you're doing a weak spot build or you're doing a crit build, then add it in those respective spots. Right now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about armor values. How much armor do different enemies have? Well, I've actually tested quite a few enemies, and the results were mixed at best. That makes it really tricky to pin down the exact amount of armor each type of enemy has. Typically, games tend to scale armor based off of the enemy type and the enemy level. However, with Once Human, this does feel a little bit inconsistent. So just for a couple quick examples, our training dummy seems to have roughly 5% armor. The Ravenous Hunter on normal seems to have about 0% armor, while the pro version has around 12.5% armor. A level 43 regular deviant enemy has about 25% armor. And an open world elite at the same level seems to have about 62.5% armor. However, things get a little bit tricky here, because when we hit that elite's weak spot, the elite's effective armor seems to drop down to about 5%. Now, I don't think this is a bug, and I think this is actually probably a feature that the devs have coded in, forcing metas to prioritize weak spot damage over normal body damage. And while this does seem to make sense, it makes things a little bit more complicated. Based on my tests, I would assume this runs the entire scope of the game and is not only done on a few select enemies. So where does this actually leave us? Well, we've seen how crucial your weapon's base damage can be in determining your final damage output. And given what we've recently learned about armor, I would say, in general, you would probably want to prioritize weak spot builds over crit builds for general gameplay. There will be a few niche bosses that realistically don't have weak spots, or weak spots that are easy to hit, and a crit build would be better on them. But for the most part, I would suggest trying to build into weak spot damage. And when it comes to armor, it does vary wildly between enemies, their levels, and other factors. Unfortunately, there isn't just a one-size-fits-all rule, like common enemies always have 5% armor. Just be aware that while armor does provide protection, it doesn't seem to cover all enemy hit zones equally. As we saw with the Arbiter, the difference in weak spot armor versus normal body part armor seemed to be pretty huge. If you're really looking to maximize your stats, I would actually recommend using the game's preset system and use this to swap between multiple builds depending on the situation. If you know you're going to be facing enemies with weak spots, consider running a build that leverages this. And if you know that most of the enemies aren't going to have an easy to hit weak spot, go ahead and switch out to your crit build. Doing this will ensure that you are using the right build for the right situation and make sure that you are not leaving good damage on the table. Alright guys, hopefully you enjoyed the video. I tried to make it as robust as I could without beating you over the head with too many numbers. Keep in mind this is just for base weapon damage and it doesn't really go into status damage. If it's something you want to see in the future, again let me know down in the comments and we'll create a whole video on weapon status damage and how to increase it. So thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the content, consider liking and subscribing for more Once Human content, as well as other games in the future. Thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day.